So if survival of the fittest is really just about organisms surviving long enough to reproduce and pass on their genes, let's look at how they do that. There's really two big strategies with living things that ensure that their genes are propagated and show up in the next generation. So basically that their species survives. The two ways are kind of described by two different species types that do this. Opportunistic species are species of organisms that can produce a really high number of offspring in a single event, but there's kind of a downside to it. Most of those offspring will not survive. So the term opportunistic happens because they sort of take advantage of environmental changes. These are organisms that can adapt very quickly to changes in the environment. Um, these are organisms that tend to mature and reproduce very early in life and reproduce often. Very low care or even no care for their offspring. So these are not situations where the parents raise the babies, at least not for very long. And then low survivorship of the offspring. But there are a lot of them. So with this strategy, the idea is have a ton of babies and most of them probably won't make it, but because you have so many, then some of them probably will. And so you're throwing all your energy into the numbers. And then, like I said, hopefully a couple of them will survive to reproduce. So that's one strategy. We see this a lot with fish, with invertebrates. Reptiles, it can kind of go either way. We'll see that there's some reptiles that embrace the other strategy as well. And when we look at the other type, the other strategy here, contrarily, we have equilibrium species. So this is the opposite strategy. With this strategy, these are animals or plants, but in this case, really just animals that live in a more predictable, stable environment. So they're better equipped for survival under those conditions and better at enduring environmental changes. They tend to mature and reproduce much later in life. They usually have a high care rate for their offspring, so they care and raise their babies. And they're better at maintaining homeostasis than opportunistic species. So these are organisms that typically are what we would call warm-blooded, homeothermic, meaning they generate their own body heat. So they can maintain, at least temperature-wise, and in other respects too, they can maintain homeostasis better. And they also usually tend to have longer lifetimes. So this really includes mammals and birds are in this category. So these are animals that you think of when you think of animals that raise their babies and teach them how to survive. And so those babies have a better chance of surviving till adulthood than the opportunistic babies do. But there's fewer of them. Parents can only put so much energy into raising so many babies. And so fewer babies, but have a higher likelihood of survival. So those are the two big categories. So that having been said, how do we see population growth actually occur? Well, it can be kind of simple. Immigration or emigration, so animals coming into or leaving a population. It depends on the fecundity of the organisms. That's basically their capability, their capacity to reproduce, the lifespan, environmental factors, so that's climate and changes in the geology, and then ecosystem factors like predators and food that's available. So when we talk about organisms moving into or out of a specific population, the word recruitment is typically used. So in this example here, barnacles, we start to see barnacles, for example, growing on higher and higher rocks or pilings, so they're able to tolerate being out of the water more. So that would be an example of recruitment. They're starting to come into an area where they weren't previously found. So excessive growth of a population can happen when you don't have a lot of limiting factors. So there aren't a lot of predators, or there's plenty of food and nutrients available. So an example of that, like we said before, was eutrophication. Ultimately, though, excessive overpopulation leads to the ultimate downfall of that population because ultimately they're going to overconsume their resources, and then you see the population drop down. So that's kind of the key point. That's sort of the crux of ecological balance, is that when you have an excessive amount of a specific population, it will eventually decline just because it will use up all of its resources. So what we see is that rapidly growing populations tend to undergo pretty exponential growth. So we put it on a graph here. We show the plot of the population, so the numbers of individuals in the population, and then time. And so over time, we see rapid exponential growth when you have these situations where you have excessive availability of food and resources, nothing stopping them or nothing restricting them. So again, this can't go on forever. Once the resources are used up, the population curve changes. So we see a different graph. So here it's kind of the same, right? You have population size and time, early rapid growth, it's exponentially growing. Then, they're starting to kind of hit that middle ground where they're using up resources, and then eventually that growth falls to zero. Okay, so this is the key thing here. The growth falls to zero. It stops growing. Eventually, you could see this line decline if the population is so huge that you have disease taking over, and that's going to start killing off individuals. But what we see here is not quite that. We see just the slowdown of growth and then growth stopping. And there's a term for when that happens, and that's called the carrying capacity. So the carrying capacity is basically the maximum limit that an ecosystem can support a population. So past that point, growth stops. So crowded populations tend to be high density. That'll have a slower rate of growth, and so this concept can be what's called density dependent. So what's actually happening? What is physically happening in the population to slow this rate? It could be new babies are not being born as much, under the strain of fewer and fewer resources, then maybe more of the older or sick members of the population are dying off. So it's not that everybody's suddenly dying, it's that you have a situation where not as many are coming into the population or being born, and maybe a lot more are dying that are, older. As they pass away, they're not being replaced by a lot of new babies. So we also see density independence. That can be a change in growth rate that's not a factor of the population density and use of resources. So think about that, and think about if you can think of any examples of that happening. I'll leave this one kind of open-ended for you to think about. So we also refer to organisms that maximize the reproductive rates early and fast. They can deal with changes in the population very easily. So this actually is kind of just redefining what we already looked at, equilibrium versus opportunistic species. So our strategists refer to typically all opportunistic species. Again, they have a low tolerance to changes in the environment, so they reproduce early and often, and with genetic mutations, there's a higher chance that babies might have some sort of genetic advantage that their parents didn't have. So that's also something that can ensure that they survive. Low care of their young. And then the case strategists are, again, the equilibrium species. So they can tolerate changes better, but they reproduce later in life and have a high care of young. So that's just a distinction there. Okay, so next we're going to look at communities and how they can interact a little bit. So this is where the drama kind of starts up. Communities refer to populations of different species that make up one habitat at the same time. So before we were looking at populations, which is members of the same species. Now we're going to kind of change it up a bit. We're going to look at communities. So we have different species living together. How they interact with each other, they could have predator-prey relationships, they could have symbiotic relationships, or they could be in competition for the same resources. So what we see here is another term that's really important in ecology, and that is that different organisms can fill different roles in their communities. And these roles are called the niches. A niche is something you've probably heard. Somebody might say, oh, you found your niche, meaning you found an activity or something that really defines you or that you really enjoy. And so it kind of means a similar thing here. An organism's niche is its role. A point of confusion, a lot of the times people think that its niche is the same thing as saying its habitat, and that's not true. A niche is a description of what an organism does. It's not so much about where it lives. So it's a behavior element. So let's take a look at that. Crabs, for example, are scavengers. So they tend to eat and process food that is basically dead material, dead organic matter from other organisms. So there's two ways to view this, an organism's niche. You have what's called a fundamental niche, and that's basically the largest possible range of resources the organism is capable of eating or being involved with. And the realized niche is the actual range of resources. So here's an example. Here's some birds from the Galapagos Islands, and way back at the beginning of the year we talked about Darwin and his finches. So here's some of these finches. And they fill 3 different niches because they have different beak shapes, so they eat different things. And so in this sense, we're talking about their niche as sort of what they are eating in their ecosystem. So they might, this one here has a broad, sort of a dense beak that's for breaking apart seeds. This one has a long, narrow one for eating insects. And so there might be a little bit of overlap where they have a little bit of the same, maybe this one can eat a few seeds, maybe this one sometimes eats insects. So there might be an overlap in their niche a little bit. But basically, to look at a fundamental niche is basically all that they're capable of doing. So in the case of the birds, maybe this one is capable of eating nuts and berries, but it doesn't. It chooses to eat the insects because that's what it's better adapted to. So its fundamental niche would be insects and berries and nuts, but its realized niche is going to be just the nuts. Or, I'm sorry, just the insects, just the thing that it actually eats. On this graph here, I have a different example. So let's say you have organisms that live in a certain area of a certain moisture here on the x-axis, the y-axis, and then a certain temperature on the x-axis. So they might be capable of tolerating a much wider range of moisture and temperature. That would be their fundamental niche. But when we look at where they actually and what they actually endure in their environment, that's the realized niche. That's what they are actually doing. So anyway, let's look real quick at competition. So this is fighting for food and resources. A couple different types. Intraspecific is when members of the same species are competing. And interspecific is members of different species competing. And an important thing here to remember is that two groups of organisms cannot occupy the same niche. So when there's overlap is when there's intense competition. And what tends to happen is something called competitive exclusion, where one of them is going to be the loser and one of them is going to be the winner. So one species is going to be displaced from its niche by a more capable species. So the more capable, the more fit is going to win that niche. So what can happen though is when you have organisms competing for a similar resource in a niche, and let's say they're both equally good, like they're the same capability for obtaining that resource, we can have something that happens called resource partitioning. And we go back to our finches, for example, that's a great example of that. So in this case, the finches are all pretty equally capable of dealing with their environments and obtaining different food sources. So if they're all trying to eat insects, then somebody's got to go. Somebody's got to emigrate out of that area and find somewhere else to live and something else to eat. But if they're all equally good at that, then what can happen is some of them are going to evolve to use the resources differently in the population, or maybe they're going to use different resources within the within the community. So within the community of different species of finches, some of them are going to now start to eat something else. So that's kind of what resource partitioning means. And I'll show you here on this graph, you have a divergence, a split. So here's the beginning graph where you have some overlap in orange there, that's competition. So you have this curve represents one species niche in a community, and then this green curve represents the other species niche. And so a divergence is when basically they stop sharing the same resources. So that's what happened here with the finches. They've stopped sharing the same resources. On the micro level, we see this too. Nutrients play a really big role. They're often recycled to fuel primary producers. And so we see different niches, especially on the microscopic level. Some big differences here between a food web and a food chain is important. A food web is pretty complex, as you can see. A food chain is a way to basically track the original energy from the sun all the way from the producers to the consumers. And I won't spend too much more time on that because you've seen that before already. Also applied on the scale of macroorganisms, we see what's called a keystone species. So that would be a species that is really critical to the health of the community. So here's an example in the kelp forest. Otters are considered a keystone species because when they are present, they eat urchins and they eat abalone and they eat a bunch of different invertebrates. The biggest thing is urchins though, and when there's no sea otters around, the urchin population explodes. And the urchins kind of get out of hand, and they actually take down entire kelp forests because there's too many of them. So urchins overrun the population, and then the kelp forest tends to decline when you have a lack of sea otters.